While we have now seen some movement within our mechanism by specifying some desired velocities under the motors, that's not typically how you would want to be able to control a machine that you're simulating within Vortex. Instead, you're normally going to be receiving data from some sort of input device, be it a USB joystick, CAN bus controls, or any other kind of data interface to receive data from a set of hardware. Now, out of the box, Vortex does support using USB controls to be able to control any kind of system. And so we're going to be adding a joystick interface here inside of our forklift mechanism. So notice that I just closed the assembly that I was working in for the past few steps, and now I'm going to be going back at the mechanism level and adding a joystick to be able to control this machine. Now, the way to add that joystick is going to be using the toolbox as we've seen before, and we have a section that's called Input Devices. In here, I'll be able to double click on joystick to add a joystick element inside of the mechanism. Now, the joystick appears on the right hand side as an object, just like many of the other components that we've seen before, and it has a whole series of different fields that represent all the different inputs, or I should say outputs, that it generates. So that's something that I haven't necessarily explained before, but in Vortex talk, outputs are things that an object are going to be producing. So here we have the output section, and so this is data that this element produces that I can use and propagate through the rest of the system. We do also have an input section in some cases that could be used to do configuration of objects. In this case, there are actually no inputs for the joystick. At the very bottom, we're going to see that we have a section called parameters. And so that section is going to be used to indicate some configuration elements for this extension that will be used but that will not be modifiable while the simulation takes place. On the other hand, anything that would be in the input section could be changed. Again, in this case, there are no inputs, only outputs and one parameter. So now if I go and I run, one thing you're not seeing on screen, of course, is that I actually have a gamepad that's connected to the computer that I'm running this on. And so as I go and I move the various controls here, now I'm using a gamepad, more specifically the Logitech F310. And so that's a gamepad that's very similar to a PlayStation controller from the gaming platform. And so it has two thumbsticks, and as I move these sticks around, I'm going to see that I have different values that are getting generated that are going to appear here within the editor. If I go in and I click some of the buttons that I have, I'm going to see checkboxes that are going to light up based on which buttons I'm actually pressing. And so now if I stop, I'll be able to look at connecting these various inputs to the actual constraints that I have inside of my system. Now, where we're going to be creating these connections is inside of something called the connection container. So under the basic section here of the toolbox, I have connection container. I can double click on it to get a workspace where I can look at connecting items together. Now, I want to connect data coming from my joystick to the actual constraints that we had before. And so the way that I'll do this is that I'm going to drag and drop a few of the elements from the joystick object into the connection workspace. As I do that, I'm going to see that I'm going to have boxes that get created reflecting all of the different elements that I'm drag and dropping inside of this workspace. So here we're seeing an element called joystick. It tells us that it's an input devices of type joystick. Of course, here joystick is the name of this object, which I could have changed. Then underneath, we're going to see that we have an output for axis Z rote that I've brought inside of here. And so now I could go and connect this to somewhere else within the system. If I want to make connections from multiple data sources, what I would then do is bring in other elements, like here, axis X. I would drag and drop into here, and so then it's going to add the field to this box. So both of those are coming from the same extension inside of the mechanism design, and so they're being grouped together here inside of a single box. Now on the other hand, if I look at the assembly and something like the rear wheels, If I want to connect the desired velocity, I can drag and drop this into here, but that's going to appear in its own separate box because it's somewhere else within the hierarchy that we have here under this mechanism. Similarly, I can do the same with pivot and go and bring in its desired velocity on the other side. Now, one thing you'll notice is that there are blue circles that appear next to any element that I bring in inside of the connection editor. That indicates that there is a connection that's going to this object. Now, to actually create the links, what I'll do is I'm going to use a drag and drop operation between the source and the destination of each of the connections. So in this case, axis 0, which is forward motion on my right thumbstick, is going to be driving the rear wheel desired velocity. So I click and drag from one to the other, and that creates the link. I'm going to do the same here between the axis X and the pivot, and so now I'll be able to use that to steer. And so if I go back to my 3D view and I run, now I'll see that by default the vehicle is going to be at rest. So these values from the joystick that are that have zeros are now taking precedence over anything I had written here. We can see this showing 0 degrees per second. And so now on the right stick I can actually use this to be able to specify the thrust or the actual throttle, and then I can use the other thumbstick to be able to steer.